Disney told us the ride was closed for maintenance, but the guests in the last clamshell swear they saw her head start to spin, not like a robot, but like something trying to snap its own neck. Everyone knows Ursula is the biggest animatronic in the park. Everyone knows about her 2018 malfunction. But if you count the moving parts in the background of that video, you'll see it. A seventh tentacle made of a different material, moving in a different rhythm. And every year it gets a little bit longer. I'm a 27-year-old female, and I worked at the park for 5 years. I was on the ride a couple times when I had time off, because of nostalgic reasons, as The Little Mermaid movie was one of the films I grew up watching, and Ursula had always been my favorite villain. But then I've heard stories from other guests who had small children, who had gone on the ride, and they reported some really creepy and disturbing things. The shift in the air at the park became impossible to ignore. When you've walked those tunnels for 5 years, the magic wears off and is replaced by a deep understanding of how things are supposed to look. When they don't, it's not just a glitch. It's a violation of your second home. Working at the park for 5 years changes you. You stop seeing the Magic Kingdom and start seeing the machine. As a 27-year-old who grew up on a steady diet of 90s Disney VHS tapes, I thought I knew Ursula. She was a dragon-inspired queen of the sea, the villain I rooted for because she was unapologetically loud and powerful. But the Ursula sitting in the grotto of the Little Mermaid ride today isn't one from my childhood. During my shifts, I'd occasionally have to traverse the tunnels near the ride's foundation. You get used to the smells of a theme park: popcorn, treated water, and industrial grease. But lately near Ursula's Bay, there was something else. A scent like stagnant tide pools and copper. I started paying attention to the guest relations logs. Most of them were standard. Ride stopped for 10 minutes. Clamshell was sticky. But then there were the ones from the parents. One report from 2023 stuck with me. A mother claimed her 4-year-old son had a meltdown in the grotto. When they got to the unloading area, the boy was hysterical, clutching his own throat. He kept saying, "The lady in the dark has my name in her pocket." She pulled it out with her extra hand. Then I watched the tape. The footage is grainy, likely taken from a maintenance work-like camera that shouldn't have been recording. It's the 2018 malfunction, but from an angle the public never saw. As her head begins that nauseating 360-degree snap, the camera pans down. Behind the 6 mechanical tentacles, the ones I've seen the schematics for 1,000 times, there's a thick, translucent appendage. It's not bolted to the frame. It's threading through the machinery like a vine. It's pale, almost the color of a drowned person's skin, and it's covered in small, irregular bumps that look less like suction cups and more like knuckles. As I watched, the 7th tentacle didn't follow the ride's programming. While the others swayed in their loop, this one reached out. It brushed against the edge of a passing clamshell. In the seat was a small child, looking back with a face of pure silent terror. The tentacle didn't attack. It just tapped the child's shadow on the floor of the car, then retreated into the grease-blackened pit beneath the animatronic. I paused the frame. In the dim light of the video, I noticed a detail that made my stomach turn. Attached to the skin of that 7th limb were tiny, shimmering objects. They looked like discarded pins, guest name tags. I recognized one of them. It belonged to a coordinator who resigned suddenly 3 years ago and was never heard from again. The question isn't just why it's there. The question is, if that tentacle gets longer every year, what happens when it's long enough to reach the control booth or the exit? The shift in the air at the park became impossible to ignore. After seeing that name tag on the tape, glimmering against the pale knuckle flesh of the 7th tentacle, I just couldn't clock in and out anymore. Every time I walked past the entrance to the grotto, I felt a physical weight on my chest, like the atmospheric pressure of the deep sea. I decided to do something reckless. Using my supervisor badge, I pulled the maintenance logs for the Ursula A100 unit for the last 3 years. I expected to see reports of hydraulic leaks or sensor errors. Instead, the logs were a mess of non-applicable and redacted lines. But one technician, an old-timer named Miller, who had been with the park since the ride opened, had left handwritten notes in the margins of the digital printouts. Unit weight increasing, 40 pounds over spec this month. Where is the mass coming from? The sound is changing. It's not the servos anymore. It sounds like breathing. I refuse to go into the pit alone. Miller had retired a month before that tape showed up at my doorstep. I tried calling him, but his number was disconnected. The next night, I stayed late. The park was clear, the music had been turned down to that eerie low-volume after-hours hum, and the work lights cast long, skeletal shadows across the empty clamshells. I walked to the edge of the grotto. Without the show lights and the loud, brassy soundtrack of Poor Unfortunate Souls, the ride was terrifyingly quiet. I leaned over the railing, shining my heavy-duty flashlight down into the pit, the mechanical abyss beneath Ursula's massive, rotating torso. At first, I saw the usual: cables, steel supports, and the thick coats of black grease. Then my light hit something that didn't reflect like metal. It was the 7th tentacle. It was no longer tucked away. It had grown significantly since the 2018 footage. It was now thick as a tree trunk, coiled around the main hydraulic pillar like a boa constrictor. As my light moved over it, the skin twitched, and those knuckle-like bumps I'd seen on the tape, they were opening. They weren't knuckles. They were eyes. Dozens of small, milky white eyes opened along the length of the appendage, blinking in the harsh glare of my flashlight. They weren't looking at the right track. They all swiveled, with agonizing slowness, to look directly up at me. A sound rose from the pit. It wasn't the wet, sliding sound I'd imagined. It was a chorus of whispers, hundreds of them, layering over each other. It sounded like a crowded room where everyone is speaking at once, but no one is breathing. "Ursula?" I whispered, the word feeling ridiculous and heavy in my mouth. The animatronic's head, which was powered down and facing the back wall, suddenly jerked. Snap! It didn't turn. With the smooth glide of a $10 million robot, it ratcheted inch by inch until she was staring at me. Her plastic jaw dropped open. But the voice that came out wasn't the actress's voice from the movie. It was the voice of the coordinator who had disappeared 3 years ago. "Check the bottom of the clamshell." The voice rasped, vibrating through the floorboards. "Look at what we've been collecting for her." I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and turned my light towards the nearest empty clamshell. I knelt down and looked at the very bottom. In the crevice where the seat meets the floor, a place no guest or janitor ever thinks to check, the entire floor of the car was lined with hair. Human hair woven into a fine, dark carpet, pulsing faintly as if it were still attached to a scalp. I then realized that the 7th tentacle didn't just want shadows or name tags. It was building something. As I looked back at Ursula, I saw the 7th tentacle beginning to uncoil from the pillar, reaching up toward the railing where I stood. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a harvest. I didn't run. My legs felt like they were filled with the same heavy, freezing water that seemed to be leaking into my lungs. I watched that pale, eye-covered limb crest over the railing, its movement fluid and predatory. It didn't have the jerky limitations of a machine. It moved like a thought. The whispering from the pit intensified, a rhythmic chanting that started to sync up with my own heartbeat. I looked back at Ursula's face, that familiar painted-on sneer. but the purple skin of the animatronic was beginning to crack. Through the fissures, I didn't see wires or circuit boards. I saw something dark and wet, pushing through the plastic like a seedling breaking through concrete. The seventh tentacle touched the toe of my work boot. It was cold, colder than the industrial freezers in the park kitchens. 5 years. The voice of the missing coordinator hissed from Ursula's frozen mouth. 5 years of walking over us. 5 years of feeding the machine. You've been part of the grotto longer than most, haven't you? I then realized why the tape had been sent to me. It wasn't a warning from a friend, it was a summons. I looked down at the seventh tentacle as it began to wrap around my ankle. One of the milky eyes on its surface rolled down to look at my ID badge. The knuckles on the limb began to shift and reform right before my eyes. The pale flesh began to mimic the fabric of my uniform. It was learning my texture. It was becoming me. "What do you want?" I choked out, my voice cracking in the dark. The answer didn't come from the animatronic. It came from the clamshells. All at once, the entire line of ride vehicles, dozens of them, began to cycle. They didn't move at their usual walking pace. They began to spin and whir, the hair carpeted on their floor standing on end like iron filings near a magnet. "The ride never closes," the chorus of whispers chanted. "The park is just the skin. We are the bone. We need a new voice to lead the choir." The seventh tentacle pulled hard. I slammed into the metal grating of the walkway. My flashlight tumbled over the edge, falling into the pit. As it fell, the beam strobed against the walls of the abyss, revealing the true scale of the horror. The seventh tentacle wasn't alone. Deep in the foundations of the ride, hundreds of these pale, organic limbs were woven together, forming a massive pulsing heart of flesh that sat beneath the park's soil. Every malfunction in the park's history, every guest who wandered off, every resignation, they were all here. They were knitted into the biomass. I gripped the railing, my fingernails tearing against the metal. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the tape that the mysterious sender had left. I realized there was a note tucked into the sleeve of the plastic case that I hadn't noticed before. I pulled it out as the tentacle dragged me toward the edge. In the dim, flickering light of the ride's emergency exit sign, I read the jagged handwriting. "She loves a fan. You were her favorite. Don't let her go hungry." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The mysterious sender wasn't a survivor. It was Miller. He hadn't retired. He had been the one before me, and he had traded my life for his release. As my upper body slid over the edge of the pit, I looked up one last time. Ursula's head had snapped back into its show position. The work lights flickered out. In the total darkness, the only thing I could see were the hundreds of milky eyes on the seventh tentacle, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent hunger. I felt the knuckles on the limb tighten around my waist. They weren't just tapping me anymore, they were sinking in. The next morning, the park opened at 9 a.m. The Little Mermaid ride was listed as temporarily closed for maintenance, but if you were staying near the entrance, you might have seen a new technician walking out of the tunnels. She looked about 27. She wore my name tag. She smiled at the guests, but her neck moved with a strange, ratcheting hitch. And if you looked closely at her shadow on the bright Florida pavement, you'd notice it had one too many limbs. The seventh tentacle is no longer growing. It has found what it was looking for.